Okay, Dad, good morning.
Good
Today
morning.
is Wednesday, October 2nd, and you know what we got to talk about. We got to talk about this Iranian missile attack. So, could you just start us off by telling us what happened, and then we'll dive into the weeds?
Okay, yeah. Yesterday, actually, it was yesterday morning. Here Eastern, U.S. Eastern time, I started to get reports that an attack was imminent, and then it happened. It The missiles were launched shortly thereafter. You hear differing estimates of the number of missiles fired, but they tend to the estimates cluster around 200, maybe 250 missiles were fired. And these were, according to the Iranians, they're not their best, but clearly this was, as Scott Ritter describes it, the good stuff. And that first attack, it wasn't really an attack. Okay, we'll call it the demonstration that was done in April by Iran. That largely consisted of drones, slow-moving drones that took hours, something like 5 hours, to reach Israel from Iran. Cruise missiles that are also relatively slow, and then a very few ballistic missiles, high speed ballistic missiles, and those came at the end. They did actually, hit their targets, and clearly that was all for show. Um, uh, this time it was real. These were, I think, it was almost entirely the strike was made up almost entirely of ballistic missiles that reached Israel very quickly in something like 12, 15 minutes at the most. Um, if you remember, in the first attack, it was the U.S. Air Force was um, um, played a very major role in shooting down these drones and cruise missiles, and as did the French and the British. And
And the
in fact, probably,
Jordanians
yeah,
as
even the
well.
Jordanians played a role. That's true. In fact, probably most of the incoming drones and missiles were shot down by British, American, and French missiles fired from their planes. This time, the Americans apparently did fire at least a dozen, maybe 18 air defense missiles. And it's not clear if they shot down anything. Maybe they did, but they clearly weren't able to do much. They didn't have time to react, and so I think it's very revealing. There was a lot of triumphalism after that first demonstration show. Now, I think again, people like us, um, people who dissent from mainstream media, pointed this out, that this was not, this was not reflective of Iran's capabilities. I mean, just these slow moving drones were going to be easy to shoot down. And Iran knew that and knew they were going to be shot down. They sent them, partly as just to telegraph their intentions, because they didn't actually intend to cause major destruction. They also depleted a lot of the, interceptors and air-to-air missiles that were used, and then they also were able to gather intelligence. So, this is something we pointed out, but in the West, and even up to like just the day before this attack, I was seeing reports that, this just proved that the Iranians were extremely weak. I was reading a New York Times piece that came out a day before the missile launch, was saying, well, it looks like probably these Iranians aren't going to do anything because they've been exposed as a paper tiger. They're weak. Back in April, their attempt at attacking Israel was just pathetic. And I took, I guess, some grim satisfaction from that. That we've criticized that point and pointed out the fallacy of that position. And sometimes I wonder, well, maybe we're wrong, but well, we were right. The New York Times was wrong, and that was shown that this attack, again, we're talking about 200 or so ballistic missiles, clearly, deeply, and clearly overwhelmed Israel's air defenses. Because, you've seen anybody who's spent any time, just like looking at the videos that are out there that are available. There were many dozens and dozens of impacts just appearing in these videos. There's one that I remember seeing in particular that shows I counted 20 impacts. Major explosions is clearly, you don't know exactly what they're hitting, but they've gone through. They were not intercepted, and they're striking Israeli territory. And we have. It's clear that they hit at least 3 Israeli air bases. They hit a gathering of actually armored vehicles in Gaza to help Hamas there and to protect Gaza, defend Gaza. They hit targets in Tel Aviv, and again, you can see videos of buildings being struck directly there in Tel Aviv. There's also reports that they hit like gas rigs off the coast of Israel. So it was extensive. It was major. It in the end, I think initially maybe a certain number of missiles were intercepted. I remember looking at like the first videos that came out, and you could see interceptions towards the end, like that one with the 20. I think you saw 20 come down, and maybe one was intercepted. One.
Yeah.
It was just like they could do nothing. They were defenseless. Now, Israel is claiming that there were no casualties, and I've read like there was a piece that came out in the Guardian, the British newspaper, that said that indicates that this was military failure. Well, first of all, let's say it indicates no such thing. It's not like your point is of attack like this is casualties, military or civilian. You want to strike installations, you want to strike, infrastructure. And so that's simply not a valid point. But I think it also is important to remember that Israel has a history of lying about casualties in previous missile attacks. For example, during the 1991 Gulf War, the Saddam Hussein fired Scud missiles into Israel. And at the time, Israel claimed that there were no casualties. And it was years later, it was revealed that there were 14 people were killed and dozens of people were injured. So it's, again, Israel has a history of lying about these things. So there's no reason to believe that. But even if it's true, it does not mean that this was a failure. Because there's no reason to believe that that's what Iran was intending to do. And then there's also, these ridiculous reports. Of course, I think you were pointing out to me that the major news channels here in the U.S. were celebrating the amazing air defense of Israel, and it's just like, again, you don't have to. You don't have to. In a minute, you can get videos just showing that that's absurd. That their air defense, certainly at some point just was overwhelmed, but then there was other ones. I think there was a CNN story, and then this Guardian story that I mentioned earlier. They referred to, they admitted that fragments fell on Israel and made impact, and it's just silly. Look at the video. Fragments don't go. Don't strike the ground, at that speed and cause massive explosions. If they're fragments, then they're rather awesome fragments. And
right, it's little meteors. At that point.
It's really silly, but it's clear that these. It's a reminder too that why we have to do what we're doing, and other dissident. Why we have dissident media. It's just that the mainstream media has ceased to be, about honest reporting. Again, you can just in some cases they can be reporting. You can see in the background, what's going on there, that they're lying. They're not describing the reality. But they have been given guidelines, how you're supposed to report things, and they follow the guidelines regardless of what. And
Yeah, but the
So,
power of mainstream media is still there. Even if
mhm,
people see with their own eyes the videos of these things hitting, a lot of people will still believe.
yeah,
For example, I have a good friend that's in the National Guard. I was texting him during this time, and he thinks that the Iron Dome and these stat systems took down over 90% of these missiles. And I was just like, dude, just watch the videos. Can you corroborate that in any way? Is there any evidence of any footage showing where the majority of the missiles were intercepted? And I can't see any. I haven't been able to find anything. So
mhm,
we may never know the truth, exactly what percentage were hit their targets. But it's just clear if you just look online that the Iron Dome failed, and this is
right,
proof that Israel is defenseless when it comes to these types of barrages. And who knows, what percentage of their interceptors they've expended and how many more they have for another barrage, because this one, it didn't seem like they had a lot to fire at it. I mean, there are 180 ballistic missiles, and like you said, in the later salvos that hit Israel, I didn't some of those videos. I didn't see any even
right,
attempt at an
right,
interception.
right.
So it seemed
Sometimes
like
maybe
they
you might
just.
see one interception out of 20 or just none. So it's clear, maybe they intercepted a fairly high percentage of the first ones came in. Maybe,
But even
I
then, I
actually,
haven't seen the
I think
footage.
that's doubtful because, again, it's just like even the Ukrainians, who are always exaggerating their interception, success, and have, to much to the amusement of many of us, have sometimes claimed to have shot down more missiles than were fired or whatever. They have, recently come out and said like they only get like 5% of the ballistic missiles, as they're, these, and some of these were hypersonic apparently. I remember at least seeing one where this, a particularly fast moving missiles, it struck, it hit its target, but it was, but the other ones they're difficult to hit. I mean, even with the very advanced systems. So I think it's very doubtful that they got even a high percentage of the initial ones. I'm sure they got some of them, but at the end, and we saw those, they had nothing. And it just shows that, and this was a limited attack by Iran. I think a few years ago, like the U.S. estimated that they had 8,000 missiles in their arsenal, but they certainly have more now. Now we talk about 200. That's a very small percentage of what they have. I mean, if with this they could just overwhelm Israel's air defense system, it bodes very poorly for Israel's future in a war with Iran. One
Which
thing I
is
just want to
happening
point,
now.
yeah, well, yeah. Well, one thing I wanted to point out very quickly is a lot of people say it was the Iron Dome that failed. Actually, the Iron Dome wasn't even involved in this. The Iron Dome is a system that is actually designed to intercept these small primitive rockets, mostly those fired from Gaza and some from
And
Lebanon.
the
So,
Katyusha rockets.
yeah, right. So we're talking about it's actually the David sling and the arrow system, and there were some U.S. systems too. There, I think they had the Patriot and the THAAD, and that's what we're talking about. And these are very expensive missiles. I mean, I think the $3 million for a single for an arrow missile is
Four
one to
million for a
for David.
Patriot.
Yeah, right. 4 million for a Patriot. And then on the other hand, it's less than 100,000 for one of these Iranian ballistic missiles. It costs something, but it's a very small fraction of
Right. I mean, we may not know. They're not going to tell us, but we know that these advanced interceptor missiles. There's a serious issue with production capabilities that we aren't able to
yeah.
produce much.
Oh yeah,
Ukraine
no,
doesn't
there's
have
a
any,
right,
and,
right.
and I think the Arrow too, and the those missiles, I believe they're not built in Israel. They're built in the U.S. and we're not able to crank
Yeah,
them out.
right. Yeah, yeah. For
So
example, for Patriot interceptors, I mean, it came out that we were able to, I believe, produce 550 in a year. And
right.
we're trying to crank it up to 650, and we're not we're not succeeding. The U.S. was not succeeding at that. So yeah, that just gives you an idea. In general, it looks to me like, I mean, both the U.S. and Israel is kind of an extension of the U.S. when it comes to weapons capabilities. Both the U.S. and Israel are really geared for, first of all, fighting technologically inferior opponents and overwhelming them in very brief exchanges. And they're not, they haven't prepared for a war of attrition against a peer adversary, as Russia has in Ukraine. And that's what they would have if they came, up against, if they wage war with Iran, which looks like they have every indication of doing.